All right, so today we're looking at this pavilion, and it's really something else. It's got this amazing wave-like design.
Yeah.
You know those buildings that just look like they defy gravity?
Yeah.
That's this one. It's incredible. We're going to be using an architectural analysis to really break down this pavilion. We'll be looking at, how it's structured, how sustainable it is, and even some things the designers may have overlooked. What do you think? What really stands out to you when you first see this thing?
Well, the first thing that jumps out at me is how organic it is. You know, the way it just flows and mimics the curves of nature.
It's like a frozen wave, right? Just stunning.
Exactly. Like if you took a snapshot of a wave and just froze it in time, that's what this pavilion feels like.
I'm really drawn to that organic form.
Yeah.
What do you think about that from like a design perspective?
Well, it's a great example of something called biomimicry. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I think so.
Basically, it's where architects and designers take inspiration from nature. Like they'll study how trees grow or how waves form, and they use that knowledge to design structures that are both beautiful and functional.
This, like using those natural forms helps them figure out how to make a building strong and stable.
Exactly. Nature's been doing this for millions of years, so why not learn from the best?
I totally agree.
And in this case, mimicking tree canopies or ocean waves not only creates this visual harmony with the park setting, but it can actually make the structure more efficient, too.
So it's not just about looks, it's about function, too.
Right. It's like the pavilion just emerged organically from the landscape itself.
I think that's one of the things that really makes this design so special. And it's not just the form, it's also the material, like that laminated wood.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It brings such warmth and texture to the space.
And it contrasts beautifully with the surroundings.
Yeah.
Especially if you imagine it against a more stark backdrop.
Right. It wouldn't have the same impact if it were made of like concrete or steel.
Right. Totally. It's the perfect material to complement that organic form.
And it's sustainable.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, we're talking about cross-laminated timber and glued laminated timber.
CLT and glulam for short.
Exactly. And those have a way lower carbon footprint than using traditional materials like steel or concrete.
Which is super important these days.
Huge.
Yeah.
This pavilion isn't just a beautiful structure. It's also a statement about responsible construction.
I love that.
Yeah.
Another thing that I find really amazing about this design is the structure itself. Like the way the form creates the structure. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. It's incredible.
That undulating canopy acts as the roof, and it's seamlessly supported by those integrated columns.
Yeah, and it's not just a visual trick. It's actually a very efficient way to build
Like a giant, elegant puzzle.
Totally. And those perforations you see in the canopy?
Yeah, they look amazing.
They're not just decorative. They actually serve a really important purpose.
Oh, really? What do they do?
They create this dynamic play of light and shadow throughout the day. Oh, I see.
So as the sun moves, the light filters through those perforations in different ways. And it makes the structure feel lighter, almost weightless.
Oh, that's so cool.
It's a brilliant example of how form and function can work together.
I love how those perforations filter light. But, thinking practically, I do wonder about the seating situation. Is that integrated seating along the base really enough for a structure this grand? I mean, wouldn't you want to encourage people to, linger and really enjoy the space?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you could definitely do more with the seating.
What do you think would be better?
Maybe make the seating more prominent, really draw attention to it, or integrate it more creatively into the overall design.
I can see that. Imagine people gathering under this canopy bathed in that dappled light.
Right. It could be a real social hub.
Yeah, a vibrant space for the community. And I know you were about to say this, but the analysis does point out some potential weaknesses.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not all sunshine and roses.
You're talking about those gorgeous perforations, right? Yeah, as stunning as they are, I can't help but think about a sudden downpour.
Oh, man. Turning this architectural marvel into a giant shower.
Yeah, you definitely want to have an umbrella handy. But, there are solutions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You could extend the canopy coverage a bit.
I see.
Or maybe integrate some transparent roofing material.
Yeah, keep that visual lightness, but add some practical protection from the elements.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance.
Right. And we can't forget about maintenance.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
Exposed wood like that, especially in a climate with, rain and snow and sun.
Yeah.
It's going to require some regular upkeep to make sure it lasts.
Absolutely. Sustainability isn't just about the materials you use. It's about thinking long-term and making sure the structure can stand the test of time.
I agree. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about the construction process for a minute. This level of detail with all those curves and precise elements, I mean, it must require some pretty advanced technology, right?
No, yeah, for sure.
Like digital modeling and CNC milling.
Exactly. It's not something you could just build with traditional methods.
That must have an impact on the cost and the feasibility of the project.
Definitely. It's a trade-off. You want to push the boundaries of design, but you also have to be realistic about what's possible.
Right. And it makes you wonder about the scalability of this type of construction.
Exactly.
Can these techniques be applied to more everyday projects? Or are they only really feasible for these big statement pieces with huge budgets?
That's a question worth considering.
I'm also struck by how there isn't really a clearly defined purpose for this pavilion.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Undeniably beautiful, but what is it actually for? Did the designers prioritize form over function?
You've hit on a key point. It's almost like they created this amazing sculpture, but didn't think as much about how people would actually use the space.
Right, like it's a work of art, but
Yeah.
not necessarily a functional space.
Exactly. But I think there's potential there. What if we tailored the design to specific activities?
I like that idea.
Imagine incorporating lighting for evening gatherings.
Oh, yeah. Or sound systems for performances,
I could see that.
or even adaptable flooring to accommodate different types of events.
Right. So it becomes this multifunctional space with a clear purpose.
Exactly. It's about making sure that form and function work in harmony.
Especially in a public space like this.
Right. A clear purpose enhances the user experience,
Yeah,
and it justifies those design choices,
I agree completely. It's not enough for something to just be beautiful. It needs to have a reason for being.
Exactly. It needs to serve a purpose.
And it brings up another point for me, the way this pavilion interacts with its environment. Like, it blends in beautifully with the natural surroundings, but it also feels a bit static,
I see what you mean. Like it's a captured moment frozen in time.
Exactly.
It lacks a dynamic element, something to make it truly come alive.
I think so too.
What if the pavilion could evolve?
What do you mean?
Like what if it could respond to the changing seasons?
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Imagine those perforations we talked about, the gaps in the canopy. What if those could be adjusted somehow?
Like panels that slide open and close.
Exactly. Let in more sunlight during the winter, provide shade in the summer.
Or even retract completely for protection from a sudden downpour.
Exactly. You're getting it.
That would be so cool.
We'd be adding another layer of interaction, not just with the environment, but also with the people experiencing this space.
Right. It would be constantly changing, adapting to the seasons. Like a living, breathing part of the park.
Exactly. And speaking of living things, let's go back to that biomimicry aspect for a second.
Okay.
The design is inspired by nature, but could it go even further?
What do you have in mind?
What if we incorporated actual greenery?
Oh,
Like
real.
living walls or climbing vines.
Now, that's a fantastic idea.
It would soften the lines of the structure, create a more tactile, engaging experience.
I can almost smell the jasmine wafting through the air on a warm summer evening.
It would be a feast for the senses.
It would really blur the lines between the built environment and the natural world.
Exactly. Amplify that sense of harmony we've been talking about.
I'm really digging this idea,
Yeah.
but let's not get too carried away. Incorporating living elements like that, it's not without its challenges, right?
You're absolutely right.
Like, how do you handle things like irrigation and maintenance?
Exactly. You got to think about those practical aspects.
And what about the impact of plant roots on the structure?
Yeah, that's something you'd have to carefully consider.
It's definitely a complex undertaking.
But I think the rewards could be worth it.
Agreed. This pavilion, it really sparks a conversation. It challenges us to think differently about the spaces we inhabit.
It's not just about aesthetics. It's about creating a dialogue between design and nature.
I like that.
And it reminds us that architecture is about more than just bricks and mortar. It's about crafting experiences, fostering connections, pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's about just taking a step back and appreciating the sheer beauty of a well-crafted form. Those curves are just mesmerizing. But all this talk about nature and sustainability, it makes me wonder, how do we balance these lofty ideals with the realities of construction?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. But this pavilion offers some valuable insights. It shows us that sustainable materials like CLT and glulam, they can be used to create incredibly complex and beautiful structures. Innovation doesn't have to come at the expense of the environment.
That's a good point. And it reminds us that good design goes beyond just aesthetics. It's about creating spaces that are functional, sustainable, and deeply connected to the people who use them. Speaking of connections, let's go back to that seating situation for a minute. I still think there's room for improvement.
I agree. The current seating, it feels like an afterthought, not really an integral part of the design.
Yeah.
Imagine if the seating flowed organically from the structure itself,
Oh, like,
mirroring those curves of the canopy.
now you're talking.
It would be like you're being enveloped by the pavilion, becoming part of the design.
You would really encourage people to interact with each other.
Exactly. Foster a sense of place, a sense of belonging.
I love that idea. And you know this pavilion. Despite its abstract form, it feels remarkably rooted in its surroundings.
It does.
Like it grew out of the landscape, echoing the forms of the trees and the rolling hills in the distance.
That's the beauty of biomimicry at its finest. It's not about copying nature. It's about understanding those underlying principles. The principles that make natural forms so efficient and beautiful, and then applying those principles to our own creations.
It's like finding that perfect intersection, where nature and human ingenuity come together to create something truly extraordinary. But let's be honest, no design is perfect.
True, that's part of the process.
Yeah.
It's important to acknowledge those potential challenges, the areas for improvement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we can learn and evolve as designers. And one of the biggest challenges we've talked about is that balance between form and function.
For sure. You can't have one without the other.
Right. And while this pavilion is visually stunning, does it really provide adequate shelter from the elements?
That's a good question.
Those perforations, while they're aesthetically pleasing, they do limit weather protection.
Yeah, especially in a climate that's prone to rain or snow.
Exactly.
Huh.
That could really impact the pavilion's usability.
You're raising a valid concern. Imagine being caught in a sudden downpour under that canopy.
Yeah, not ideal.
We need to think about solutions.
Like what?
Maybe retractable elements, sliding panels, even transparent roofing materials.
I see.
Something that maintains the visual lightness, but also provides some practical protection.
Right. And we also need to think about the long-term maintenance of that exposed wood.
Oh yeah, definitely. Sustainable design means thinking about the entire lifespan of the structure.
From construction to maintenance to eventual demolition.
Exactly.
And speaking of construction, let's talk about the process for a minute. This level of complexity with all the curves and the precise elements, it must require some pretty sophisticated technology, right?
It does. We're talking digital modeling, CNC milling, things that can get pretty expensive.
And that must have a big impact on the cost and the feasibility of the project.
Absolutely. It's a trade-off. The desire to push boundaries. It often comes with these practical considerations. Is this type of construction scalable? Can we apply these techniques to more everyday projects?
Or are they only really feasible for these high-budget statement pieces?
It's a question worth pondering.
I think so, too. And it raises another important question. Who is this pavilion designed for? Is it purely a work of art, meant to be admired from afar? Or is it a functional space for the community to use and enjoy?
I think it has the potential to be both. It can be a symbol of architectural innovation, a conversation starter, but also provide a gathering space, a shelter, a stage for community events.
I see what you're saying.
It's about finding that balance.
But to really achieve that potential, we need to address those functional shortcomings we've been talking about. We need to think about weather protection, seating, acoustics, and how to integrate those elements seamlessly into the overall design.
And most importantly, we need to consider the human experience.
Right. How do people move through the space?
Exactly. How do they interact with each other? How does the pavilion make them feel?
Those are the questions that really matter.
Absolutely. Those are the questions that ultimately determine the success of any design.
At the end of the day, it all comes back to the people, right?
Yeah.
We could talk about the engineering and the sustainability and all that.
Yeah.
But if the space doesn't work for the people who use it, then what's the point?
Exactly. It's got to resonate with them. It's got to enhance their lives in some way.
And that brings us to acoustics. We talked about the potential for echo and poor sound quality in this space.
Yeah, with all those hard surfaces and the open design, it's definitely something to consider.
But what if we looked at those acoustic properties as opportunities instead of problems?
Now, there's an interesting thought.
Instead of trying to dampen the sound, what if we embraced it? What if we actually enhanced those unique acoustic qualities?
I like where you're going with this.
We could incorporate elements that amplify certain frequencies.
Or use the natural reverberation to create a sense of awe.
It would be like turning the pavilion into a giant musical instrument.
I love that analogy.
Certain types of music, spoken word performances, even just ambient soundscapes, they would all take on a whole new dimension in this space.
We'd be engaging all the senses.
not just the visual.
Right. It would be a truly immersive experience.
And it would give the pavilion a more defined purpose.
Yeah, instead of just being a beautiful object.
It becomes a destination, a place where people come to have these unique sonic experiences.
It's no longer just a pavilion.
It's a sound sanctuary,
Hmm.
an acoustic amphitheater, a place where sound and architecture merge to create something truly extraordinary.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think that's what architecture is all about. Creating spaces that transcend their physical form. Spaces that inspire us and move us and connect us to something larger than ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. This pavilion, it has that potential, even with all its imperfections.
Every design has imperfections. That's what makes them interesting.
It's the flaws that make them real.
I like that. So what have we learned from this deep dive?
We've learned that buildings can be so much more than just static structures. They can be dynamic, responsive, even playful.
They can interact with their environment.
Adapt to the changing seasons.
And enhance our sensory experiences in ways we never thought possible.
And most importantly, they can bring people together.
They can foster a sense of community.
This pavilion, it's a reminder that architecture has the power to shape not only our physical world, but also our social and emotional landscapes.
And it reminds us that good design goes beyond aesthetics.
It's about creating spaces that nourish the human spirit. Maybe someday we'll find ourselves under that canopy, listening to music perfectly tailored to those unique acoustics, marveling at the harmony of form and function. That wraps up our deep dive for today. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the intricacies of this fascinating pavilion. Architecture is all around us, waiting to be discovered and appreciated. So keep your eyes open, your minds curious, and your ears tuned for those unexpected delights. Until next time, happy exploring.